Now let's turn to Iran, which is a topic we've been covering here every Friday, as well as internally with a number of discussions. We have a pleasure of being joined this morning by Avi Melamed. He's a former Israeli intelligence officer and senior Arab affairs advisor in the Israeli government. Welcome, Avi. It's a pleasure to have you. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your take on the war in Iran.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And for this discussion, I'm joined by my colleagues David Goodstone and Chip Usher. Over to you, gentlemen, if you want to kick it off with a question for Avi.
Good morning, Avi. Great to have you with us. I guess my first question is for your take on the state of the war. We saw this week Israel taking out Ari Larijani, the head of the Iranian National Security Council, as well as Basij commanders. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz is now the main center of gravity for the conflict. Please give us your analysis of where we are currently in the war.
Well, good morning. Thank you. Actually, since day one of this war, I was kind of like illustrating the war to what I call the poker game. And as of now, it seems to me like that illustration is still very valid when you look at the different regional players, and I'm emphasizing regional players involved in the war, namely Iran, the Arab Gulf monarchies, Israel, the Iranian proxies. You see a very interesting, I would say, moves by the players around the table. All in all, when you try to assess the moves of the players on the ground, namely Israel or the Iranian and so on, you see that each and every one of them is still trying to exhaust its strong cards and at the same time still try to identify the weak cards of the other side. So I would say that roughly speaking, going along this analogy, I would say that we have witnessed this week, the Iranians are raising the bet, so to speaking. They are kind of like continuing the walking on the edge because they believe that as of now, and I emphasize as of now, they still have the capacity to reach to the point they want to reach in the end of this war, and that is to come back to a negotiation place from a position that does not reflect a defeat and basically reflect the ability of the regime to sustain that war and actually to come from some sort of like strength, relatively speaking, to the negotiations once they are going to be resumed.
Thank you, Avi. I wonder if you could tell us the view from Israel. The Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an address to the nation last night. He was very clear on the goals of the campaign from an Israeli perspective, namely taking out Iran's nuclear capacity, the ballistic missiles, and creating the conditions, at least, for regime change. Where do you assess progress versus those goals from the Israeli perspective?
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent announcement actually reflects some sort of like re-evaluation or recorrection of the Israeli course in terms of defining the ultimate strategic objective. There has been some vagueness, unclarity regarding the Israeli strategic objective in the end of the day. It wasn't really clear what is exactly the ultimate objective. So you heard about, toppling down the regime and taking down the missile industries and so on and so on. It seems to me like there has been some sort of like recalculation of the Israeli course and trying to redefine more clearly the objectives that I would say in the end of the day could be evaluated as achievable. So in that regard, I look at Mr. Netanyahu's statement as something that represents this recalculation. And I think that when you compared it to the mostly recent Israeli / US attacks on Iranians' military infrastructure and industry, you could see very clearly that indeed that's the direction, meaning focusing on the Iranian missiles capacities and the Iranian producing capacities. Hence, I think that this is the light to see at Mr. Netanyahu's recent present.
Yeah. I can go next. Avi, thank you so much. You're a close observer and expert really on regional affairs as well. I was curious if you could share your assessment of how is the region positioning itself in this war? And particularly, I'm interested in your perspective on the long term. Do you see opportunities for Abraham Accords expansion on the back end of this war? Do you see the GCC maybe moving closer to China, or maybe you don't see any big shifts as the war concludes?
Well, thank you for the question. And actually, a couple of levels of the question that needs to be addressed differently. So let me start saying a few words about the region and the way it views the world. There are a couple of interesting things here. First, as you probably may know, the Arab Gulf monarchies, prior to the war, at least formally, put pressure on President Trump to avoid the war. They kind of like emphasized the need for diplomatic track, which in a way, on the one hand, is ironic because the Iranian regime is their biggest threat already before the war, let alone following the war. Yet at the same time, it's interesting to see that the Arab monarchies were under the impression or the hope that if a war is going to break, then they will be immune. They will be left out on the sideline. They were very wrong because the first thing the Iranian regime rushed to do and continues to do is to attack its neighbors, the Arab Gulf monarchies. Again, it goes back to the story of the poker game. The Iranian regime identified the card of the attacking the infrastructure of the Arab Gulf energy industry as the sweet spot, sort of speaking, in order to put pressure on President Trump to create by doing that, creating a global crisis, economic crisis, and through that, basically putting pressure on President Trump to hold the war. So the outcome of that is that now we are 20 days into this war, and the Arab Gulf monarchies continue to sustain, and they will continue to sustain the Iranian attacks. Now, obviously, that kind of like shocked the Arab Gulf monarchies at first, and then it resulted in a growing fury and anger and so on, as you could understand, vis-a-vis their neighbor, the Iranian regime. Now, in the context of the Middle East, I think it's important to understand that you got different levels of, I would say, conveying messages. There is the diplomatic formal level, and there is the non-diplomatic formal level. It seems like that there are reports indicating that in the last couple of days, the Arab Gulf monarchies basically are making a shift in a way, basically putting beyond the scene pressure on President Trump to further escalate and to decisively win this war. What guides the Arab Gulf monarchies in that regard was that first they basically, tends to think that maybe they are much better with a weaker Iranian regime. Now maybe they are coming to the conclusion that they are maybe much, much better without this Iranian regime as their neighbor. So this is one interesting aspect to follow. There is another interesting aspect that I have been following, which is very puzzling, and this is the story of the biggest and powerful state, Arab state in the region, that is called Egypt. Egypt not only was like on the sideline up until recently, but Egypt in a way, interesting enough, at least seems to be like that the Egyptian basically in a way kind of like took the Iranian side. And that is a very interesting story because it has resulted in a growing tension between Egypt and between the Arab Gulf monarchies, to the point that actually that tension clearly spilled over to the social media networks. And the last couple of days, the network was basically booming with accusation flying on both sides from Egypt to the Arab Gulf monarchies and vice versa. Now, this is very puzzling because Egypt, to a large extent, is very much dependent upon the Arab Gulf monarchies, the economy of Egypt. There are some 10 million Egyptians working in the Arab Gulf states. United Arab Emirates just recently signed a $25 billion agreement with Egypt to develop a touristic city. Qatar streamed some $3.5 billion to Egypt in the late 25. Saudi Arabia gave guarantees to Egypt to take loans from the International Monetary Fund. So all in all, when you look at that, it's very puzzling. And indeed, in the last, I would say, 48 hours, the Egyptians realized that they are shooting themselves in the leg, if not worse. And so we witnessed a very rushed, desperate Egyptian attempt to do damage control, manifested in the fact that the Egyptian government issued a statement basically calling for all social media and formal media to avoid the attacks on the Arab Gulf monarchies. And parallel to that, President Sisi himself went with a delegation to the Arab Gulf states to Qatar, to United Arab Emirates. He emphasized that the national security of the Arab Gulf monarchies is an extension of Egypt's national security. So this is a very interesting episode because one must wonder what will be the ramifications. The Egyptians clearly hope that the Arab Gulf monarchies will have a short memory. I'm not so sure that that's going to be the case. So this is one other interesting thing to follow in that regard. Another interesting, significant arena to follow in the region is the situation in Lebanon, the growing and expanding confrontation between Israel and the Hezbollah. Attached to that, there are more and more reports indicating that the Syrian army is also deployed in a massive presence along what is known as the Syrian-Lebanese border. The word border is a little bit misleading because there is no physical border between Syria and Lebanon, though there is a border passage. Just the same, we should definitely watch very closely the Lebanese arena, because I would say that that will be an arena that will continue to be probably very active even once the war with Iran comes to an end. I would say to a large extent that we should expect in that specific arena, Lebanon, to a much more decisive outcome in the sense that Hezbollah, by the end of this situation, will basically not any longer will be able to continue and dictate its radical agenda on the region. One other arena that we should look very closely is Yemen. As of now, Houthis in Yemen remain on the sideline, and for a good reasons. And as of now, they are still on the sideline. Obviously, we have to follow that to see if there is going to be some change, particularly in the context of the growing, I would say, standoff or power struggle regarding the Hormuz Strait. As of trying to look forward, understanding the potential ramifications, I think it's premature at this point to come to decisive conclusions, but I would say that we are definitely, of course, witnessing a very pivotal moment in the story of the Middle East. Hopefully, the weakening of the Iranian regime will basically contribute to a much better geostrategic stability in the region. This is a regime that has been destabilizing this whole region, particularly in the last couple of decades. I would expect that one of the major ramifications would be in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and hopefully, and I add the word hopefully, the combination of the weakening of Hamas in Gaza Strip with the weakening of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course the weakening of the Iranian regime, could result in a twist or a change in the Israeli-Palestinian trajectory that thus far has been very negative because the Iranians and their proxies were the one dictating the escalation of that trajectory. I think that we could expect a shift in that trajectory, which, as in it for itself, is a good news. Obviously, at least as a preliminary phase. Looking a little bit beyond that, I would say beyond the regional, the geostrategic horizon, I think that one of the things that we have to look is that the Arab Gulf monarchies, and I would say that very cautiously, there is a growing sense of disappointment in a way within, I'd say, the American administration in Israel because of the fact that the Arab Gulf monarchies are contained with defense capacities rather than using their offense capacities. That may result in a situation where the compensation would be, sort of speaking, by a big arm deals between the Arab Gulf monarchies and the United States. I think that in that regard, obviously the military performances both Israel and the United States exhibit thus far definitely further will increase the appetite or need of the Arab Gulf monarchies to be armed with such capacities, particularly the defensive one. As for China and Russia, again, very interesting, but not surprising. They are kind of like on the sideline up until now, but I think that we could expect that the more the crisis continues and the ramifications are increasing, negatively speaking, particularly in the context of China, we could expect a growing Chinese-Russian influence or pressure on the Iranian regime to call it a day. We also have remembered that the Chinese are massively invested in the Arab Gulf monarchies. The attacks of the Iranian on the energy infrastructure thus far, relatively speaking, has not directed at a Chinese directly related facilities, but the Chinese, I would say more and more every day that goes by, the Chinese are getting more and more uncomfortable, let's put it this way. And thus, I think that they will put more pressure on the Iranian regime beyond the scene to call it a day.
Yeah, Avi, I think all incredible and really hard to assess what's going on, in the midst of a war. As you guys know, the fog of war is always one of the things that makes analysis hard to see. But I think, as you mentioned, I think, we're seeing so much going on in the region. I think our end goal really is to see that that the region is ultimately coming out to a better place after all of this. And so, Avi, thanks so much for your update. Great to see you. Thanks so much for your time.
Of course, thank you for having me.